Okay, so now it's recorded. So let me start over again. This is our last session in this course, which is What History Left Out Part 1. We will continue next week with a new seminar, our September seminars that we have for 4 weeks. And this one will be on what is Canada to the African, play off of Frederick Douglass's speech, what to the slave is the 4th of July. We're going to be talking about the African relationship with Canada, both inside of Canada and outside of Canada. So that will be what we'll discuss during the month of September. From October to November, we'll have another 8-week course, or She-Rose course. We look at African women resistance leaders from October to November. December, we will have another seminar celebrating the 500th anniversary of the first large-scale rebellion in the Americas. So we'll talk about rebellions in December. And then we'll pick up with the second part of this class in January. So African history from 7/11 to 1896 will go from January through February. So that's our schedule. That is actually available in terms of how our year looks. You will also be able to read up on more information on anything we talked about over the past 8 weeks on our course website. That's always available. It's free to you. You can access those sources, and you can even look in the bibliographies of those sources for other things. Because what we do in this class is just a general overview. We don't go into a whole lot of detail. We give some detail, but not a whole lot. I leave that to you all. If you want to learn more about Nubia, if you want to learn more about Ghana, if you want to learn more about the Swahili city-states and the Bantu migration, there's more information than what we talked about. We just gave a general overview. So I encourage everybody to look and stay up on the most current information and look for yourself to learn this African history that we can never learn completely. It's a lifelong journey to learn as much as we can. So with that being said, also at the end of today's session, before I turn off the recording, we'll also do our post-test. We did a pre-test or pre-assessment to see what you knew coming in, and now we'll do a post-assessment to see what you know coming out. Just 10 questions, and we'll see how you do. So hopefully you wrote down your score. We did the first pre-assessment, and you want to see if you can better that score with the questions that we have at the end. As always, I'll talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll take a break for Q&A. Then I'll pick up again for another 25, 30 minutes. We'll do the post-test, and then I will turn off the recording, and we can have open discussion. Today, though, our open discussion can only go to about 12:35, 12:40, because I do have a mentorship meeting today with Jack Ukamba that I have to get on at 1, so we can't go too long today. All right. So, timeline, what are we talking about today? We've done a lot in this class. We've started from even before this timeline starts. We started around, at around 10,000 BC. We talked about the emergence of early man, even before that, around 300,000 years ago. But we really got into the meat of our history around 5,000 years ago. We talked about what was going on in the Nile Valley civilizations, and we talked about North Africa. We talked about the Bantu migrations. We talked about the East African coast. We talked about Nubia. And last week we talked about Aksum. So last week we were around here and the emergence of Christianity in Africa. We spent a lot of time around here between 0 and around 350 CE. Today, we're going to be in a very important 200 to 250 year period from around 500 CE to 711. This is what we're going to be discussing today. So a lot of important events happen in the African world during this time, particularly in Northeast Africa. And really, the entire world at this time is becoming more and more connected. And that connectivity, that globalization is going to continue all the way up into the present. But we're going to start to see the world becoming much more connected at this time. The further we go up in time, the clearer of a picture we get of what is going on in history. The less reliance we have to have on archaeology and other types of sources to reconstruct history, the more it becomes slightly easier. So we get more oral history becomes more reliable starting around this time. as well as more written history from various vantage points. We get more and more evidence as we get up to the modern period. So we're going to talk about just these 200 years, but a lot of things go down. You'll notice now this map, these kingdoms, these empires didn't all exist at the same time, but this does give you an idea of some of the major players in Africa. And this map says around 700, but even going back further to the period that we're starting with, about 500, you see some of the major players. We talked about the emergence of Ghana a few weeks ago with Daniel, the teaching assistant for this course, who's also been letting you in, talked about Ghana and its emergence. We talked about what was going on in North Africa with the Amazigh, or the Berber folks, and the kingdom of Numidia and its relationship with Rome. We talked about Nubia and Aksum and Egypt and the Bantu migrations that were happening during this time that started around here in eastern Nigeria, Cameroon, and spreading all the way throughout Central Africa, and that was going to ultimately lead to the emergence of these kingdoms. Outside of our chronological scope of this class, but Congo and Lunda and Luba and the others, and Bundu, and all these kingdoms that emerged in the Congo River Basin. Great Zimbabwe, which we'll get into in January. We talked about the Swahili city states that emerged during this time that were engaged in trade throughout the Indian Ocean world. So we're going right back up here today, and we're going to talk about Aksum, which we talked about last week with King Azana's conversion to Christianity. And we also talked about King Azana's invasion of Merowe, which kind of put an end to the dominance of Nubia in the region. Even though the states in what's now Sudan we'll talk about them, they don't go completely away. They're just not as prominent as they were when they were united Nubia before King Azana sacked Merowe. So Aksum was a major player. It's one of the big players in the world because it has grown rich off of its trade, control of trade in the Red Sea area on both sides of the Red Sea, both in Northeast Africa as well as Southern Arabia and Yemen. So around 500, Aksum was a major player, but it's not the only major player in the region. And our evidence for what's going on in this period from 500 to 711 comes to us from Greek. A lot of the sources on Aksum, Nubia, even Egypt at the time, are written in Greek. Greek was one of the languages of commerce during this time. So the ruling classes in Aksum wrote in Greek. They also had their own language, Ge'ez, their own written language, Ge'ez, that they wrote in. But they also wrote in Greek because that way they could communicate with the other major power in the region, which was Roman-controlled Egypt and even further north, the Byzantine Romans, or the Eastern Roman Empire. Even though they were Romans and they traced their lineage back to Caesar and Augustus and the Roman emperors, at some point during the Roman Empire, there was a split between the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. And the Eastern part had always been richer, and they communicated in Greek. So that language permeated the region because that's one of the major powers. So a lot of the stuff that we know is written in Greek, written in Ge'ez, some sources written in Latin. Later on, as we talk today, Arabic becomes one of the major languages of the region, but at the beginning part of this period, it's not that important. And of course, Coptic Egyptian is also one of the major languages, written languages that we have to document this period. Then, of course, we still can rely on the archaeology, particularly when we talk about the presence of Ethiopia in Southern Arabia. We get a lot from the archaeology. We see a lot of inscriptions in Ge'ez, in what's now Yemen, and in other parts of Southern Arabia, the Southern Arabian Peninsula. So Aksum, this major kingdom, controlling trade, getting rich, its capital of Al-Dalis, right on the Red Sea, once in modern day Eritrea, very prominent kingdom. And the important thing to remember is that its influence extended on both sides of the Red Sea. And again, controlled the trade with India, going as far east, even as China. So all of this stuff is connected. The world is becoming more and more interconnected through trade and the growth of these large empires in this part of the world. But even when we go west, we see that Ethiopia or Aksum may have been the terminus on the western end of the or the end point of the Indian Ocean trade, but it's also the end point going east of this trade that extends all the way to Ghana. So you have in this region of Africa where the savanna emerges, where the Sahara meets the grasslands, the Sahel, all the way from Ghana and West Africa to Aksum, you had trade routes that took goods all the way throughout, and trade routes going south to north. So Aksum is getting rich, being at a terminus point of west-east trade as well as east-west trade. So very, very important geographical position that allowed the rulers of Aksum to become incredibly wealthy. So having control of both sides of the Red Sea was incredibly important. And by the time we get to the year 570, which in the Quran is known as the year of the elephant, we'll talk about why that is. So a lot of the story I'm going to talk about today has a very intimate connection with the birth of Islam, because actually in the year of the elephant, according to the Quran in 570, traditionally speaking, and we don't know, that date is contested by historians. But in the Quran, this is the year that Muhammad is born. And it's a very interesting year because there is a certain king, Abraha, the Ethiopian king, that ruled this region, Yemen and Southern Arabia, from his capital in Sinai, which is still the capital of Yemen. He ruled, and he has a very interesting story, which we'll talk about. But this was the year that Muhammad was born. And it was King Abraha who took elephants and wanted to sack Mecca in the year 570. But according to the Quran, according to Islamic history and tradition, when his war elephants came, and actually, let me go back. Let me talk about who he is, and I'll talk about why he wanted to attack Mecca. This is before there is such thing as a Muslim. This is the year that Muhammad is born, traditionally 1570. But let me talk about who King Abraha is. This is a very interesting story. So like I said, the kings of Aksum at this point are Christian, and they're very powerful, and they control both sides of the Red Sea. Their major enemy, the major rival to Aksum, are the Sanasid Persian Empire, the Persians. These are the major rivals for Aksum, even though Aksum is not shown on this map. Why? Because they both want to control the trade coming from the east, coming from India, coming from as far east as China. The Persians want that trade to go through the Persian Gulf that they control. The Aksumites want that trade to go through the Red Sea. Let me just go to that other map so you can see. The Persians want the trade to go from here, these ports, and through the Persian Gulf exclusively. Even, some of the trade was going there, but they want all of it. The Aksumites want the trade to go from here to here and then to the Roman world. So they're fighting over Arabia, parts of Arabia. The Persians and the Aksumites are fighting over parts of southern Arabia. And then, of course, the Arabian tribes clans are fighting amongst themselves. It's not until the time of Muhammad and the emergence of Islam that the Arabs unite. And when they do, that spells trouble for everybody else. But at this point, the Arabs are fighting each other, and then Persia and Aksum, being the major players in the region, are fighting over control over southern Arabia. Who's going to control these trade routes? And then to the north, you have the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, that has an allegiance with the Kingdom of Aksum. Why? Because they share the same religion. They're both Christians. So as part of this battle with Persia and this proxy war that's going on in southern Arabia, the king of Aksum leads a campaign and eventually takes over a number of towns in what's now Yemen. And one of the fighters, one of the soldiers in this war is Abraha. Abraha is a soldier. He's not a king yet. He's a soldier. But according to one of the Greek historians, a man by the name of, and I hope this has not, here we go. A historian writing in the city of Constantinople, a historian named Procopius. Procopius is a historian who writes in Greek, and he's based out of Constantinople. And he writes a book called The History of Wars. And I have the translation here from the Greek, but this is a very old book, so the English is very old too. The English translation of this Greek is very old, but it talks about King Abraha. So I want to read the entire passage because it's a very interesting story. But in this war with Persia, Helistheothius, which these are Greek names of Ethiopian names, so I'll just say the king of Ethiopia, a very devout Christian, hearing how the said Homerites, and these are the folks that lived in Yemen, Homerites, of the opposite continent, were many of them Jews and many heathen, and laid excessive burdens upon the Christians. He sent out a navy and army against them, and fighting with them, routed them, and slew their king and much people. Having made a certain Symphius, king of them, a Homerite and a Christian, and imposed a tribute upon them, he went home. So let me translate that. The Ethiopian king who's a Christian hears about these Christians being persecuted by folks in Yemen, right across the sea. That's probably was just a justification for doing what he did. So he goes and sends a navy and army against these people, and they win. And then he sets a proxy king, a Yemenite king who happened to be a Christian, over them, and then imposed tribute. So that king was supposed to give taxes back to the king in Ethiopia, back to the king in Aksum. But something happens. However, in the Ethiopian army were many, both slaves and lewd persons, that would not follow the king home, but stayed with the Himerites, being in love with the country as being very good land. But not long after, the people imprisoned the proxy king and made one Abramus their king. Abramus and Abraha are the same person. This is a Greek version of his name. So Abramus, their king, a Christian who had been a slave to a Roman merchant residing for his traffic in the Ethiopian city of Adulis. The Ethiopian king wanted to punish Abramus because Abramus was just a slave. He's just a slave soldier that was in the army that decided, why don't we just take over? Instead of paying tribute back home to Ethiopia, we can just take over and start our own kingdom. And I guess he was so popular among the troops that they agreed, and they overthrew the proxy king. And you get Abramus, who becomes king and of a different kingdom, an Ethiopian established kingdom in Yemen. And he refuses to pay taxes to the big king in Aksum. And the king, and I won't go into all this, but then the king of Aksum had sent a bunch of troops against him, and he couldn't defeat him. And then he tries again, but then he gives up. So we have a independent Ethiopian kingdom in southern Arabia, with its capital at Sana'a in Yemen. So that's here. But Abraha doesn't stop there. So Abraha is a devout Christian. He wants to build a cathedral, and he's also fighting against the Persians as well. And he wants to make a pilgrimage site in his capital of Sana'a in Yemen. He wants to build a cathedral, and he wants people to go there because, if you have pilgrims, a lot of people that go there, that increases traffic, that increases taxes, people buy things, it'll make your kingdom even richer if you have a pilgrimage site. But the problem with Abraha is all of these Arabs, now some of these Arabs have become Jewish, most of them still follow the traditional Arab religion, and they all make pilgrimage to Mecca. So this is before Islam. The Kaaba in Mecca, that meteorite rock that's in Mecca that is sacred to Muslims, was already sacred to Arabs before Islam and is in Mecca. People used to go there to make pilgrimage. So Abraha says, if I destroy the Kaaba, I can have that pilgrimage money diverted to my capital in southern Yemen. So he goes on an expedition against Mecca in the year that Muhammad was born. And he has war elephants, the same way that Hannibal Barca, we talked about a couple sessions ago in Carthage, brought war elephants into Europe. He brings war elephants to Mecca with the desire to tear down the Kaaba, to tear down this pilgrimage site so that people could come to his pilgrimage site. Well, according to the Quran, according to Islamic tradition, when his elephants come, God protects the Kaaba by having these birds come and drop rocks on the elephants. There's thousands of birds, and they drop all these rocks on these elephants, and it makes his soldiers retreat, and he doesn't get to take Mecca. And that's why it's called the Year of the Elephant, because the Meccans were afraid that this Ethiopian king was going to destroy Mecca and destroy the Kaaba, and that was a prominent date in Arab history. We say it's the year 570 because it's believed that Muhammad got his first revelation at the age of 40, and then he dies in 632. So they just subtract the years. That's how we get to the year 570. So that's that's contested by historians, excuse me. If it actually happened in 570, if it actually happened that way. But we do know that King Abraha did exist. We have other sources to verify his existence, and inscriptions in southern Yemen, and the architectural works that he did. And he probably did make a move against Mecca as well. So the interesting idea, when we talk about the relationship between Aksum in southern Arabia, Aksum in Yemen, and this major role that Aksum plays as a major power in the region in the development of Islam. So this first time we get this mentioned in the Year of the Elephant, but it won't be the last time. Because after Muhammad gets his revelation of the Quran at the age of 40, he's born into a merchant family in Mecca, he's orphaned and all of that. By the time he gets to 40, he has his revelation of the Quran, and he starts to get some followers around him. But the ruling tribe in Mecca, the Quraysh, they are persecuting him and his early followers. And the first flight is not to Medina. The first flight of Muhammad's followers is actually to Aksum. They see the king of Aksum as being a peaceful man, a tolerant man. So some of Muhammad's early followers actually traveled to Aksum to escape persecution. And then Muhammad would later, go to Medina, make the flight to Medina, and then the movement would continue to grow. So throughout Muhammad's lifetime, the Arabs will become united under this new ideology of Islam and become a force. Islam unites the Arab tribes and clans that have been fighting each other over control of different oases in the Arabian desert from time immemorial. Islam now unites them. So these are a nomadic people that have mastered desert warfare, fighting against each other, and now they're united. And they're a force that nobody was prepared for. Aksum wasn't prepared for them becoming a force. The Persians weren't prepared for them becoming a force, and the Romans weren't prepared for the Arabs becoming a force. This happens very quickly. From the time Muhammad dies in 632, 100 years later, you'll see how much area the Arabs control. At the time, with the addition of Aksum, the two other powers, like I mentioned, are the Roman Empire, the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire. You see, Rome used to control everything. It used to control Britain and Spain and parts of Germany and France. But by this time, the Western Roman Empire has pretty much collapsed. And this is the start of what historians used to call the European Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. But the Eastern Roman Empire is still going strong. And they are in battle with the Persians over who's going to control this region and these trade routes that are going all the way to the Indian subcontinent and as far east as China. And in fact, the Romans make a deal with the Aksumites to fight against the Persians. And we see that in, again, this tale. You see here, let me just zoom in. Where did it go? So after this historical text talks about Abraha or Abramus, the writer Procopius goes on to say, these things happen afterward. But then during the reigns of Eliseus and Epiphanius, Justinian sent his ambassador to desire their confederates against the Persians. So all this means is the Romans went to the Ethiopians and said, look, let's go against the Persians because they're messing up trade for all of us. The Romans and they consenting in one religion because they were both Christians. They said, look, we're Christians, the Persians are, for the most part, Zoroastrians. If we unite, us major powers, the Ethiopians and the Romans, we can get rid of the Persians, and then it would allow you, for the Romans made this offer to the Ethiopians. They said that the Ethiopians would make themselves masters of a rich trade by dealing with the Indians for their silk and selling it to the Romans, who should have this only advantage therein that they should carry out their money to their enemies for it. And this silk are made the anciently called Persian, now Syriac silk garments. All this means is this: the Romans didn't want to have to go through the Persians to get this silk. And they wanted to destroy the Persian Empire. So they met with their co-religious folks, the Ethiopians, to fight against the Persians. We don't know what really came of that arrangement. We don't know how much the Ethiopians actually gave to that effort of fighting against the Persians, even aside from their skirmishes in southern Arabia. Because from the Ethiopian standpoint, they're making good money anyway. So, they don't need to have an all-out war with the Persians the way that the Romans did. So while all this is going on, the Romans are fighting the Persians, the Ethiopians are on the side of the Romans, and they're also engaging some proxy wars against the Persians. The Arabs explode out of Arabia. United by Islam, they have experience as expert cavalrymen with using camels and horses. They're able to overwhelm their enemies because, again, they had so much practice fighting against each other for centuries. So as these two are fighting each other, they're not prepared for the Arabs. The Arabs come and they attack both of them, both the Romans and the Persians, who are weak from fighting each other. And the Arabs expand. So you look at this. Islamic world under Muhammad from 622 to 632, it's just this. This is what you see in the dark orange. These are all the folks that had adopted Islam during the Prophet Muhammad's time, and even a little bit in Oman. These are the folks that converted, that were unified by Muhammad. The next 30 years, under the first four caliphs, or the first four leaders of the faith after Muhammad dies, you see how much orange you have. All of this expansion, because it happens that quick, 30 years, because no one was prepared for these Arabs to attack. Why are they able to conquer Egypt so fast? Why are the Arabs able to conquer Egypt so fast? This goes back to something we talked about last week. The Romans had been in control of Egypt for, at this point, about 600 years. But the problem was the rulers in Rome who were Christian have adopted a different form of Christianity than the Miaphysite Christians in Egypt, the Coptic Christians in Egypt. And even though they're both Christians, they have a different form of Christianity, and the Egyptians don't want to bow to what the Romans want. And because of this, and because of Roman taxation, overtaxation of the people in Egypt, they are constantly fighting against the Romans, fighting against the Roman rulers of Egypt. So when the Arabs emerge, the Egyptians put up no resistance, or very little resistance, to the Arabs, because they say, let them come in. We don't like the Romans anyway. We don't like Roman control. So if the Arabs want to come in and kick out the Romans, let them. Maybe we'll get better taxes. And in fact, the tax situation was actually better under the Arabs. However, Procopius, yeah, I think that's his name. We'll talk about that, David. So when the Arabs come in the Niger Delta region in northern Egypt, very little resistance from the Coptic Egyptians, from the Egyptian folks, that the everyday people and the soldiers. The problem is they realize that the Arabs aren't just coming to sack the town, they're actually coming to control. And So it was kind of a miscalculation on the part of the Egyptians, thinking that, okay, we'll get the Romans out with the Arabs. So although the tax situation was better, the Arabs come and they start their own control over Egypt. And then later on, 2 centuries later, in the 9th century, we get a migration of Arab peasants into Egypt. And this is how Egypt really becomes Arabized, where the Arabic language starts to take precedent over Coptic, where Islam really starts to spread down the Nile River. Between those years of around the 640s, 670s, all the way down into the 9th century, Egypt becomes Arabized. So when we talk to people about why it seems as though Egypt is different from the rest of Africa, or we are confused as to why the ancient Egyptians, who are they connected to? They're not connected necessarily to the folks that you see prominently in Egypt today. These are the descendants of an Arab migration that happens in the 9th century CE. The Coptic Egyptians that lived there, that have this connection to the ancient Egyptians, but the Arab folks that are in control, that have been controlling since this, come during this time. So that's a very interesting, important thing to understand. That Arab migration comes a lot later. But just like every other invader of Egypt, the Arabs soon realized that the true prize in the Nile Valley is not just Egypt. Egypt has a lot of grain, you can feed a lot of people, the Nile still produces a lot of agricultural goods, but the luxury items going all the way back into the ancient world are in Nubia. So the Arabs don't want to stop. I mean, they're winning. I mean, it was really easy to occupy Egypt, to control the Nile up to the first cataract, up to Aswan. So they're feeling confident. So they want to invade Nubia, because this is where the money really is. By the time we get, this is the border. This is what the Arabs control, everything up north of Aswan, and then the rest is Nubia. The things have changed a little bit in Nubia since the time that Azana had attacked Merowe. You had, where you used to have 1 kingdom, now you had 3 kingdoms. Mabada, Archery, and Alodia. Sometime around the 5th century or the 400s, the Nubians become Christians, or the rulers of Nubia become Christians. Why did they do that? The same reason Azana did that, or one of the reasons why Azana did that. You become Christian because now you can have a relationship with Egypt and the other power in the region, Egypt, which is controlled by Constantinople or the Byzantine Romans, who are Christian. So this whole region becomes Christian by the time we get to the 5th century. Everything from here down is Christian. And then in 650, just right around the time that the Arabs are getting control over Egypt, these 2 kingdoms unite and form a united Nubian kingdom around or just before 650 CE. So when the Arabs try to cross the first cataract to take over control of Nubia, these Christian rulers who are united by their faith, they are, nominal allies of the Romans who had just been defeated in Egypt. They defend their country against the Arab onslaught. Back in the day, remember we talked about this, Nubia used to be called by the Egyptians Taseti, or the land of the bow. Well, the Arabs got that understanding too. When they went there to go up against the Nubians, they called them the Rumat al-Hadak, or the pupil smiters. What that means is the Nubian archers were so talented that from long distances away, they could knock your eye out with an arrow. Again, that's that Taseti. That's the land of the bow. So going back all the way to ancient times, the Nubians have been masters at archery, and the Arabs found this out firsthand. They were unable to defeat the Nubians who were defending their land. So they had a lot of skirmishes all around this first cataract, this traditional border between Egypt and Nubia. And it really came to a head in 652, where there was a major battle. At first, the Arabs had gone even further south and sacked one of the major towns in Nubia. The Nubians responded till ultimately we get a peace treaty called the Bact, which is one of the longest peace treaties in world history, signed in 652 between Nubia and Arab-controlled Egypt, which basically said, okay, we won't fight each other anymore. Nubians are allowed to travel to do business in Egypt. Egyptians are able to do business in Nubia. The Nubians have to keep a mosque in Nubia in order for Egyptians and Arabs to have a place to worship when they're in Nubia, and will exchange gifts between each other from time to time. That peace treaty lasted for many centuries. So the Bact is a very interesting interesting piece of diplomatic history where you have this treaty. So again, it just goes to show history repeating itself. As we talked about Queen Amani Reines and her defense of Nubia against Roman aggression coming from Egypt. And now we see the Christian kingdoms of Nubia defending their kingdoms against Arab-controlled Egypt. So a very interesting time period in terms of African defense. All right, so we'll stop there for a second and open it up to any questions. And I saw one in the chat already, and you can raise your hand if you have a question, from David H. Is the name of the historian really Procopius? That is his name, yes. Procopius of Caesarea is his full name. Procopius of Caesarea was the name of that historian who lived around the 600s in the Eastern Roman Empire. Any other questions or comments about this first part? You could raise your hand or you could put it in the chat. See your hand. Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Good morning, all. This is more a comment than a question. As now that the lecture is what it is this morning, I can certainly understand how the snitches and the sellouts were brought to the forefront.
That's true. That's true. You see a lot of opportunities for these things to happen, people to make those decisions. Yes, sir. Other questions, comments? Will, go ahead.
Hi, Clyde. Question for you is like, when the Arabs came to Egypt, right, and till this day, why do you think they kept the name Egypt? Because we know that name is, is Greek. How come they didn't change that name into an Arabic name? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's because it had become so established. Some of these things carry over. And even during the Roman times, the Romans didn't change it from Egyptos or Egypt. So I think it just became so established. One of the things that the Arabs did do is they renamed the capital, or they created a new capital called Cairo. Yeah, that's Arabic. It's very close to the old Egyptian capital of Memphis, going back thousands of years ago. That's why the pyramids of Giza are near Cairo. So they did do that, and they changed the names of a lot of the towns, but not Egypt itself. I think it's because it had been so established and as a world power at this point that they just didn't change it.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Can you please tell me what is so special about Muhammad that led to an allegiance to such an extent that the Muslims have grown as much as they have today? What is special about this individual?
Muhammad, just like many characters in history, it was charismatic. And when we talk about charisma in terms of the sociological understanding of that term, you have people that emerge that are able to get followers and that are able to get, charisma is the ability of a leader who doesn't have traditional leadership, like he wasn't born into the role, who are able to motivate people and to get people to do things that they would not otherwise do. In the case of the Arabs, it was to unite. So I'm not sure all the qualities of Muhammad. I mean, we know that he was a good speaker, he was a great motivator. Before he got his revelation, he's a merchant. So he kind of knew how to talk to people and how to engage. Probably somebody with more experience with Islamic tradition would have a better understanding, and probably the hadith, and the other traditions of the prophet would probably give more information on how he was actually able to do this, because he did something that was impossible, which was unite these Arab clans that had been fighting each other for centuries. One of the reasons being the message that he had, some folks say was simple enough without it's not as complex as Christianity and doesn't have a lot of the rituals as some of the other traditions that were around at the time, like even Judaism or Zoroastrianism, which is a big one in the Persian Empire, or some of the pagan Arab beliefs. It was very simple. You just needed to submit to Allah, pray 5 times a day. It was a very simple message, and they talked about unity so much that it attracted large populations of downtrodden folks who were in it. Now, when it starts to expand outside of the Arabian Peninsula, it's many of the same reasons you'll start to see that Christianity expand, which you have a lot of rulers that start to see, oh, wow, this new group, because it's hard sometimes and it gets complex, but to separate the religion from the Arab Empire, which you really can't do because they're so intimately connected. But as the Arabs emerge as an empire with this religion, other groups start to look and they say, other kings start to say, all right, well, if I nominally say that I'm a Muslim, I'll be able to form this connection with this new empire and we can engage in trade. You see that in Africa, you see that in Asia. Or you would just have general conquering of places. But as we'll mention in the second half, when the Arab armies first started going outside of Arabia, into Egypt, into North Africa, even into Persia, their first instinct wasn't to convert people to Islam. They wanted people to remain whatever religion that they were so that they could tax them for being that religion. They say, oh, okay, you want to stay a Christian? Yeah, that's fine, but you got to pay taxes to do so. Or, oh, you want to stay, practice your traditional religion? That's fine, but you got to pay taxes. That way that they could increase their treasuries. So it wasn't profitable to actually convert folks. And we're going to see that in North Africa.
Excuse me, Doctor. One follow-up question. It seems to me as though Muhammad was one of the forerunners to TV evangelism.
That could be possible. I mean, he was able to, in his lifetime, amass a great following for somebody that was, had no traditional power the way we would think of it. And by the time he passes, he's one of the most powerful people in the region. And then the caliphs that take over just extend that power. And then with that power comes money. And we see what happens once money really gets involved in the situation, because you start to see immediately with the successors of the prophet, folks fighting over power and money. And we start to see, you see the Sunni Shiite split, you start to see other splits among the leadership, and just another example of that. I'm gonna go to Daniel and then Kevin.
Someone in the chat just asked, does having a common big enemy equate to having a common benefit for the lower class?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depends on the situation. That's all situational. Sometimes it works out, sometimes, it's hard to answer that. I'll just say it's situational. Kevin, go ahead.
Hi, you may have answered this before, but I don't remember. Just in terms of color and what people looked like back then, I'm kind of curious to know. Were the Arabs at this point, were they dark skinned or were they already lighter skinned? Because I've heard different things. I've heard that there was a group called the Indo-Europeans that were the lighter skinned group of people in what is now Pakistan who invaded that part of the region. And the people were once dark, but became lighter as a result of that. And they are now what we now associate with the Arab looking people today. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if that is true or if was the case at this particular period or what. Like, it just gets confusing because when people say Arab, there's a certain kind of look that comes to mind versus sort of indigenous African or, Nubian or Bantu, etc. And so the people who live like today in North Africa look very different, and Egypt look very different than other Africans.
This is interesting, and I'm not going to be able to give you a full snapshot picture of what folks look like at the time because they look very different. I mean, not different from us now, but different even as this group. Let's think about what we're talking about. We're talking about this region here. And regardless of what borders don't, how do I put this? The first cataract is a border between Egypt and Nubia, but it doesn't stop people from moving and people moving back and forth. The Red Sea is not an impenetrable barrier. And we see that with the control that the Ethiopians had over both sides of the Red Sea. So you got folks throughout this entire region that have all types of racial backgrounds because people move back and forth and back and forth. You got Persians in the region, you got Ethiopians in the region, you have Nubians in the region, you got folks from Armenia in the region, Syria, like I said, there's Greeks and Romans that are going throughout this region. So at this particular time, there's so many folks with so many different heritages in the region that it would be hard to say, what the general type looked like in the region. But it probably looked very close to what you would assume someone from that region looks like today, like that North African, Southern Arabian look. Now, but what we'll say though is that group of people that came in the 9th century, that came into Egypt in the 9th century as peasants, had more of that racial makeup than the folks that were in Egypt at the time. And again, at this time in Egypt has been through a number of rulers, from the Assyrians to the Persians to the Greeks to the Romans. So even Egypt itself is a cosmopolitan place. So there's a lot of racialized mixing. But the important thing to mention at this time, that stuff isn't that important for these people here. What's important, most important for them, is culture and religion. So what you look like is not really that important to them. I mean, they're going to show it in the art. They're going to, comment on it. Say, okay, this person's dark, this person's that. But it's not. There's no characteristics attributed to that at this point. The Arabs are going to get a lot more racist as the centuries go on, and we'll talk about how that starts. Actually, we'll get into that in the second part of this class. But at this point, whether you're pagan or Christian or an infidel or Muslim, and what your cultural standing is much more important than what you physically look like at this point. The only reason I brought that up is just to make it clear that when we talk about ancient Egypt, now, so this is what we're talking about is 652 CE. When we were talking about ancient Egypt, that was 2600 BCE. And the problem that we always have to correct, unfortunately, we still got to correct, is people think that this population of folks had something to do with that, or that the Greek control of Egypt, or the Roman control of Egypt, or Persian control of Egypt had something to do with that stuff back then that we normally think about when we think about ancient Egypt. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples, those ancient pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II. None of these people were involved with that. And that is the important thing to point out for folks that like to take this part of Africa out of Africa, at least culturally. And that's the only reason I pointed that out today. Any other questions? And let me kind of speed up a little bit because we got a little bit more to discuss. And actually, yeah, I'll hold off on questions. We can pick this stuff up again in open discussion. But let me talk about the other part of this because they might answer some of that stuff. So They were not able, the Arab invasion was not able to conquer Nubia. However, they started to set their sights more to the west, into northern Africa. So Egypt is under Arab control, making their way west to the land of the Amazigh, or the Berbers, and the Numidians. And again, this part of North Africa had been in control by the Romans for some time. Well, almost again, about 600 years. And last week we talked about the Amazigh and the Numidians having problems, the same problems that they had with the Romans as the Egyptians, the problem of religion. But going back even further, we talked about the Donatists, the Numidians, who had this problem where when the Romans weren't Christian and they were attacking the church in North Africa, and they forced many of the bishops to give up sacred scriptures and to renounce their faith, and many of them did. But then when the Romans become Christian, after the Emperor Diocletian, and then when Constantine becomes emperor and they adopt, the emperor adopts Christianity and stops the persecutions, then these bishops want to come back into the faith and want to come back as church leaders. And one group led by one of the leaders that was persecuted and didn't give up, Donatists, says, no, you can't come back into the church. You definitely can't come back and become leaders in the church. The Romans wanted that issue settled, and they came to the conclusion that, no, you should allow these bishops to come back in. And St. Augustine of Hippo in North Africa was one of the major advocates for that position. So the Donatists then leave the official church, and that faith starts to spread. It becomes a faith of resistance against all things Roman in North Africa. So if you were a Donatist, you practiced a Christianity that was heavily influenced by anti-Romanism. And this was the resistance religion in the region among the Amazigh, or the Berber folks, and the Numidians in what's now Algeria and Western Libya and in Tunisia, where the Romans were. So the Romans are having all types of problems at this point. Their empire is collapsing. They've already lost Egypt. They're on the verge of losing North Africa as the Arabs are making their way west. The problem for the Arabs is this: whereas in Egypt they didn't get much resistance, when they come into the land of the Amazigh, the Berbers, they don't want to be controlled by anybody. So they want the Romans out, but unlike the Egyptians, they don't want the Arabs to come in and control anything either. And now the Arabs have a fight on their hands. And that fight lasts a long time. It's not as easy to control North and Northwest Africa as it was to control Egypt. So what we have, and one of the main leaders of this resistance is actually a woman who we'll get into more in our Shiro's class, but Dahia al-Kahina. And al-Kahina is not a last name. Al-Kahina is an Arabic word meaning the sorceress, because of course they couldn't have conceived of a woman being a leader the magnitude that Dahia was without her being a witch or a sorceress. But she was one of the main leaders of Amazigh resistance against the Arabs in North Africa. And the Arabs really met their match because these folks were just like them. They were expert cavalry fighters using cavalry, both the camel and the horse, just like the Arabs. They knew how to fight in the desert, just like the Arabs. They knew how to stick and move and maneuver the same way the Arabs did. So it wasn't like when they were fighting against the Persians or the Romans that only knew how to fight one way. These folks were their equals. But we'll talk about the tragic flaw that made their resistance ultimately a failure, or at least not as successful as it should have been. So again, all this is happening around 700. So this is 70 years after the Prophet Muhammad. So again, the Arab are expanding very quickly. Who was Dahia? She was the daughter of Tabeta, the son of Tifan of the Jawara tribe, which had always provided the kings of the Amazigh in that region. She had replaced the Amazigh ruler Kusala, who had died fighting the Arabs. And around 690, she battled Hassan ibn Numan, and she was around 50 years old at the time of this battle when she was leading these troops. against this Arab general who was based out of Egypt. So he comes out of Egypt, he fights her, she fights and defends her territory, and they go back and forth. One of the victories that she has near Tripoli, he's forced to retreat, and she captures a number of his soldiers. I won't get too much into the story, but ultimately she's betrayed because she, according to some sources, gets seduced by one of the prisoners of war that she takes, and she allows him, into her home and different things. And then he starts relaying messages back to his old general in Egypt, getting messages out about her movements and her organizations and all of that. I'll get more into that again in Shiro's class. But because of his deceit, the Arabs come back into the region and re-engage her in battle. One of the ways that she wants to stop the Arabs from progressing is she begins a slash and burn campaign in her own realm that she controls. She says if the Arabs can't eat, then they won't want to fight us. They'll leave and want to go back home. There won't be anything for them to conquer. So she burns down crops and destroys things. The problem is this causes problems with the people that she's trying to protect. She's looking at it in a long-term vision. That, all right, we'll destroy the crops for now. They'll come in, won't be able to control anything, and then they'll go back to Egypt. But the people are like, we don't want to make that sacrifice right now. We want to, continue to live. If we got to pay some extra taxes to the Arabs, so be it. So that causes disunity among her people. And then with the intelligence being provided by the spy in her camp, she is ultimately defeated by the Arabs. So, but the main thing that really defeats it is the lack of unity among the Amazigh. Even though she's one of the major rulers, there are other rulers in the territory that don't follow into her plan to resist the Arabs. And because of that disunity, more so, the Arabs didn't have superior firepower to the Amazigh, superior war technology. Like I said, they were equal in terms of how they fought. And the Amazigh even had the advantage because it's their land, so they know the land. But they didn't have the unity that the Arab forces had. The Arab forces were united by the ideology of Islam. They're united by the vision of creating this Arabic empire. So when they come in contact with the Amazigh, although they're formidable fighters, the fact that they lacked unity spelled the disaster for them. Her sons, Tahiya's sons, ultimately end up joining the force, the Arabic force. She actually tells them, this war is not going to go well for us. I want you to survive, so join with the Arabs. And they listen to their mother, and they actually join the Arabs. She actually dies in battle fighting against them. So her sons join, which is symbolic, because as the Arabs move further west, their army becomes less Arabized and more Africanized. More Numidians, more Amazigh join the army that's led by, at first, Arabic generals, and then becomes even African generals. So by the time we get to 711, the army that's going to cross over Africa into Spain and Portugal is mostly an African army. It is no longer an army made up of a majority of Arab folks, even a majority Arab leadership. It's an African army made up of Numidians, Amazigh, and other folks from Northwest Africa. Many of the folks have converted to Islam in the army. In order to avoid that tax, a lot of them, the troops converted to Islam. A lot of the generals became Muslim. So by the time we get to 711, under General Tariq, they cross the Straits of Gibraltar. Gibraltar is named after Tariq, and conquered Spain and Portugal. And this sets up the era of the Moors, the Moorish Empire that stretches from Spain and Portugal in the north into Morocco, Mauritania, and parts of Algeria in North Africa. And it's an African empire. At this point, they're speaking Arabic, they're Muslims, but the bulk of the people and the leadership and the troops that are fighting are African. So this is where we'll stop, because we will pick up with the Moors and their contributions to Europe and what they were about in January, and what else was going on in the African world around 7/11 and moving forward. From 7/11 to 1896 is the second part of this course, which we'll pick up in January. So we'll stop there for today. Before I open it up to open discussion, let's see what everybody remembers. So get ready. We're going to take a little post-assessment to see what folks remember. Just 10 questions. So what you can do is you can just write down your answers, or you can put your answer in the chat as a direct message to me, and we'll see what how folks do. Hopefully you remember what you got on the first one. All right, so some of this we just talked about, so we should be able to get it. I'll zoom in on this. All right. So number one, who were the North African Christians who, after the great persecution of Emperor Diocletian, refused to readmit church leaders who renounced their faith? They were known as A, Catholics, B, Protestants, C, Arianists, D, Donatists, or E, none of the above. Seeing a lot of diversity. And put it as a direct message, because you don't want to influence anybody's answer. Okay, if you chose, you'll see some coming in. If you chose D, Donatist, you were correct. Those were the Donatists. We just talked about this, led by Donastus, who said you can't come back into the church after you did that. All right, let's go back to something we talked about at the very beginning, probably week 2. Who was the multi-genius who designed the step pyramid and wrote manuals on numerous medical techniques? Was that A, Kwame Nkrumah, B, Imhotep, C, Mansa Musa, E, Maulana Karenga, or D, Maulana Karenga, or E, Sheikh Anta Diop? Who was that? Who was that multi-genius who designed the step pyramid at Saqqara? Take about 5 more seconds. If you chose B, Imhotep, you were correct. We talked about Imhotep. Lived during the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt. Helped design the step pyramid and was also a renowned medical doctor. Staying in ancient Egypt. So actually, no, this is not ancient Egypt. Excuse me, this is not ancient Egypt. Actually, it might be ancient Egypt. You never know. Who was the leader? Blank was the leader of who challenged the Roman Empire with conquest? Was it A, Tutmos of Egypt? Was it B, Mansa Musa of Mali? Was it C, Pianki of Nubia? Was it D, Hannibal Barca of Carthage? Was it E, none of the above? Who was the leader and what nation were they leading? Take 5 more seconds. If you answered D, Hannibal Barca, you were correct. Remember, Hannibal took those elephants over the Alps and threatened to conquer the Roman Empire. So again, if Amani Reines, not so much, because she was defending her empire. She wasn't on the offensive against Rome. Number 4, what was the West African kingdom that grew powerful on its control of gold and salt between the years 500 BCE and 1200 CE? Was it A, Morocco, B, Ghana, C, should be Ile-Ife, D, Dahomey, or E, none of the above? If you think it's E, you can write the correct answer. If you think it's E. So on number 4. Let's take about 5 more seconds for number 4. If you answered B, Ghana, you are correct. This is what Daniel talked about a few weeks ago, talking about Kingdom of Ghana. Number 5, going back to the Nile Valley. Blank is the ancient Egyptian concept containing 7 principles, which ultimately means righteousness or balance or harmony. Is it A, Odumare, B, Sankofa, C, Iwapele, D, Ma'at, or E, none of the above? If you think it's none of the above, write the correct answer. If you chose D, Ma'at, you are correct. We talked about Ma'at, I think, in week 1 and week 2. All right, number 6, the blank migrations brought what technology to many parts of Central and Southern Africa from around 3000 BCE to 1000 CE? Was that A, the Moorish that brought farming technology, B, the Bantu that brought iron technology, C, the Axumite that brought bronze technology, D, the Zulu that brought military technology, or E, none of the above? And if you think it's none of the above, write both answers. I have more seconds. Answer is B, the Bantu migrations, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, brought iron technology to many parts of Central and Southern and even East Africa during that time period. I skipped. Oh, I have 2 number 8. So number 7, who was the female ruler or the Kandake of the Kingdom of Nubia who fought the Roman Empire to a draw? Is it A, Cleopatra, B, Hatshepsut, C, Amani-Renas, D, Bilqis, or E, none of the above? And if you think it's none of the above, you can write the correct answer for extra credit. I think I may have inadvertently given this one away because I forgot that it was coming up. All right, 5 more seconds. If you answered C, Amani-Renas, you are correct. We're talking about Amani-Renas of Kush that fought the Roman Empire to a draw, again, fighting over that first cataract, that traditional border between Egypt and Nubia. The other number 8, true or false? The first humans spent less than 50,000 years in Africa before moving to other parts of the world. Is that true or false? Human beings spent less than 5,000 years moving before moving to other parts of the world. Five more seconds. All right, this takes us back to the first class. Remember, human beings developed anatomic, modern human being, Homo sapiens sapiens, around 300,000 years ago. And we spent the first 200,000 of those years in Africa before we went anywhere else, at least somewhere between 150 to 200,000 years. So that answer is false. We spent a lot of our time as human beings in Africa, developing and becoming more diverse before we went anywhere else. So that is false. Number 9, the title of this class, what is the symbol representing the quest for knowledge and return to the source that comes to us from the Akan people? Is it Ma'at? Is it Ama? Is it Iwapele? Is it Sankofa? Or is it none of the above? And everybody should know this by now. Why that O is there? And this one is easy, and many of you got it. Yes, it is D, Sankofa. Many of you got that. And last question, what is the name of the script used in the Kingdom of Aksum? So we're talking about the Kingdom of Aksum. Is it the Meroe script? Is it Metanecha? Is it Oromo? Is it Ge'ez? Or is it none of the other options? We're looking for the script used in the Kingdom of Aksum. Okay, this one's a little difficult. I see there's a lot of diversity with this answer. 5 more seconds. Okay, the answer to that was D, Ge'ez. Very close to the Meroitic script. That's further north in Nubia. And Meta Neter is even further north, excuse me, in Egypt. And Aroma wasn't written down at the time. So it's Ge'ez, it's Ge'ez. That was the script used. So think about how you did compared to how you did on the pre-test, or if you took that, or how much you knew. And think about what you didn't get right. And that may be a place where you might want to learn more information. Go back into our course website and do some reading and find other sources. Or if there's something that really interests you about any of the topics that we discussed that we didn't get to go into a whole lot of detail in, I encourage you to look it up and find books and journal articles and go to your local library or use your internet sources and find as much information as you can and learn. There's nothing wrong with learning. In fact, I always encourage folks, if you want to know the information that we talked about over the past couple of weeks, this is a good place to start. History of Africa by Kevin Chillington. It's a nice overview book that gives you the same type of information that we talked about over the past couple of weeks. It's relatively cheap on Amazon, and it has a lot of pictures and maps and things like that in it. So it's a good tool to use to get basic information. I always recommend it. All right. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating. This course comes to an end. We're going to pick up next week with what to Canada, what to the African is Canada. We'll explore Africa's relationship with Canada, Africans both inside of Canada and outside of Canada over the next 4 weeks. So that course website is still being constructed, and I'll have that for you at the beginning of next week. So that email went out. You can please join and send it out to other folks who may be interested. At this point, I'm gonna turn off the recording and open it up for general discussion.